The Model 02 release left a lot of people scratching their heads with a minimal drop in weight and not much in terms of improvements other than a pretty drastic design overhaul. A lot of people questioned if it's a mouse that really needed to be released. But we're going to take a look at the Model 02 and find out if that's really the case. Being announced not long after people started receiving their Model O Pros, an arguably better version of the Model O, a lot of people were left scratching their heads as to why Glorious needed to overhaul their most famous mouse. But these days, if you're not releasing a mouse every year or so, a lot of people can start getting pretty anxious about updates. Aside from the Model O Pro, which I'll touch on a bit later, the Model O has seen pretty minimal updates throughout its 4-year lifespan. We saw a wireless version, some simple cosmetic updates to the triggers, but that was pretty much it. They got so much right with the original release, there really hasn't been a reason to improve it. But going 4 years without a major update will leave a lot of people begging for something new. So Glorious took a pretty drastic step and completely revamped the design of the Model O. But other than the design changes and some updates to the internals, there isn't a ton new here, but there is certainly a lot to like. The wired version is about $15 more at $64.99 versus the $50 for the original Model O, and the wireless will get you for about $100, where the original Model O wireless was and still is going for $80. Glorious has gone the way of Apple with their unboxing experience, and I've got to say I'm a fan. I'm always a sucker for an elegant unboxing experience. We get this really cool slide-out box with sick documentation packet sitting up top. This has all your standard stuff, your quick start guide, a QR code to help you register your mouse, a sticker with the updated Glorious logo, and a card that specifies that your RGB brightness is set pretty low, which I think is pretty cool. Under the packet, we get our mouse itself, the USB dongle and extender, and Glorious's ascended USB-A to USB-C charging cable. The cable itself is stellar. The original white Model O wireless came with a black cable stock, which a lot of people didn't like. So it's nice to see this time around we're getting a color-matched cable with your mouse. I personally always prefer black cables no matter what color the mouse is. If you've ever owned an Apple laptop or tablet, you'll know these cables look great when you first open them, but quickly become dirty and pretty hard to clean. Given this is a paracord cable, I'd have to imagine it's that much trickier trying to keep it looking nice. The bottom of the mouse hits you with notifications of firmware updates. Early on in the M02's release, there were some buggy versions of the firmware that were causing a lot of issues, but they all seem to be ironed out as my copy came with the updated firmware, and it seems like this is just a precaution, but I didn't notice any issues. Taking the mouse out of the box, I'd be lying if I didn't say the first thing I noticed was the weight. The Model 02 wireless comes in at 68 grams, which isn't particularly impressive in 2023. If you are looking for the lightest weight possible, given that most of its direct competitors, the Viper V2 Pro, the Lamzu Atlantis, the Pulsar X2, are all clocking in at under 60 grams. At 68 grams, this is just a gram under the original Model O wireless and 13 grams heavier than the Model O Pro. The shape of the Model 02 is basically the same, with Glorious's spec sheet listing a length of 126 millimeters, a height of 38 millimeters, and a grip width of 60 millimeters. I'd have preferred they keep the measurements exactly the same, but Glorious states that the shorter length will make it easier to access the side buttons. Gone is the original honeycomb design, with Glorious opting for a more unique approach, going with circles this time, helping the Model 02 sort of separate itself from the Final Mouse clone tag it had for so long. Honestly, I prefer the look of the original Model O when it comes specifically to the holes, but both are fine. The front end of the mouse got a complete overhaul, with mouse 1 and 2 being completely redesigned. The sidewalls have been raised to help prevent the possibility of finger interference. This design change further helps cement Glorious's new design language as its own sort of design, helping it stand out more and giving it more of a unique identity. I'm a fan of this look. They got rid of the bearded logo on the side, opting for a small logo right below the DPI button, and a text logo on the outside of the mouse that is super subtle and clean. The whole design really invokes early Razer designs like the Copperhead or the Diamondback, giving someone like me super 2000s vibe, which I really dig. The texture throughout the mouse is a little bit rougher, making this mouse a little bit easier to grip. It's not super noticeable, although if you're coming directly from an original Model O, you'll likely notice a difference. Although I am a fan of this grippier texture. The entire build quality on this thing is really tough. I've always enjoyed the Model O, and I thought its build quality was always pretty stellar, despite some people having some issues with it. But Glorious really did beef this thing up. If for whatever reason having side buttons that were clickable when squeezing your mouse like some kind of a strongman was an issue for you, you'll be happy to hear that this ain't happening this time around. Glorious went to painstaking effort to make sure this mouse was built like a tank, and you can feel it. RGB is sticking around, which was shocking to some, but it's hard to argue how good the RGB looks bouncing around the inside of this mouse. It doesn't look like much has changed in terms of customability through software though, so you're still somewhat limited in terms of options, especially when you compare it to the likes of Razer and SteelSeries or Corsair. Although we're seeing less and less RGB these days, especially on peripherals where it isn't really necessary, like mice. I was happy to see RGB missing from the Model O Pro. While I understand keeping RGB around on some of the more aesthetic-focused peripherals, like keyboards, it's kind of a miss for me. Mouse 1 and 2 are using Glorious's own switches rated for 80 million clicks. I've always been a fan of these, and outside of something like the Kale 8.0s or the Huanos, these are always a win for me. Side buttons feel great. There's a little bit of pre-travel, but not something I really noticed. Scroll wheel feels very similar, if not identical to the original. Another one of my all-time favorites, so I'm happy that very little has changed in that department. Glorious's own BAMF 2.0 sensor makes its debut here. Largely feels the same compared to the original Model O. It felt like playing with the same mouse I've mained for over 2 years, so naturally this is a good thing. I feel like the biggest updates here are battery life, which Glorious advertises 210 hours of battery life, which I hate because this is in Bluetooth mode, a move that Glorious is far from the first company to do. But I always hate it when this happens, and I wish Glorious didn't pull this on us because not everyone digs that deep, and there are people out there that feel somewhat tricked when they find out that running the mouse in 2.4 gigahertz mode, the preferred mode for gaming, will net you closer to 110 hours of battery life, assuming you have the RGB off. And that's not nothing to sneeze at. That's a major improvement over the MOW's 80 hours of battery life. And personally, I feel like that's a huge win. I don't know why a company like Glorious would go that route, but hey, there's not much I can do about it other than to say I dislike it and do what I can to spread the word. The Model O2 gets Bluetooth added this time around, which allows Glorious to advertise this 210 hours of battery life. I'm never a fan of using a gaming-focused mouse to pull Bluetooth duty. If I need a productivity-focused mouse, I'd much rather go with something like the Logitech MX Master. I've always been a pretty big fan of the Model O shape. Although I don't play with it as much as I used to, opting for smaller mice these days, it always holds a pretty close place in my heart, and I always enjoy breaking out my MOW every now and again. I feel like the Model O2 is a pretty worthy successor to the original Model O, but a lot has changed since the release of the Model O. The Model O Pro was a mouse that released as a limited time group buy, and a lot of people felt like that was a more worthy successor to the original Model O. And that the Model O2 really isn't worth the extra cash given that it's not much different from the original. But as always, I feel like a lot of people assume that weight is everything to everyone, which just isn't the case. A lot of people don't really want a super lightweight mouse, and the MO2 is a much more middle ground mouse, more than the MOP was. That being said, I do wish they made the Model O Pro a full release. I really want to see the Model O Minus version get that treatment for sure. There are way more competitors to the Model O these days. Just a few short years ago, Glorious was the name in incredibly priced gaming mice, forcing the entire market to make some really big adjustments to not only how they handled their designs, but the pricing as well. It also brought a ton of new players to the market, giving customers the one thing that a lot of companies fear most: choices. I really enjoy using the Model 02 thanks to the fact that the shape is largely the same, and while there are some changes, they are mostly internal, making the jump from the original Model O pretty seamless. But design changes can be pretty polarizing. Personally, while I am a fan of this sort of nostalgic early 2000 vibes I'm getting from this mouse, I honestly have a hard time recommending it over something like Glorious's original Model O wireless. I kind of go back and forth. I really enjoy the look of the M02, but I'm always gonna love that classic Model O look. No matter what your choice is, sticking with the original Model O or opting in for the new M02, I think if you're a fan of that classic Model O shape, you'll feel like you've got a really solid mouse on your hands. If you choose to stick with the original Model O, you're not gonna feel like you're missing out on too much, but if you're like me and you can't help yourself and you snag a Model 02, for $100, you're not gonna feel like your wallet's being emptied out. It's simply just to update a new look with a new sensor. That's gonna do it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, please give that thumbs up button a push and consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my video releases. And I will catch you in the next one.